The last couple of years have seen a massive increase in the number of fantasy and science fiction television series, films, and other media, not to mention a significant rise in the popularity and visibility of LARPing, or live-action roleplay, a hobby which allows you, dear viewer, to step into the fictional world of your choice, be that fantastical, futuristic, historical, or otherwise, for which you will need a costume. If you're interested in designing and making fancy costumes for LARP, or otherwise, subscribe. While I myself am delighted to see my favourite genres getting more of an outing after what felt like a solid 2 decades of urban fantasy or Game of Thrones, no really, these are your only 2 options, it has come to my attention that fantasy costumes can be kind of confusing if you come from a primarily historical background. I see a lot of people taking one of 2 extremes. They wouldn't have had that in this period, therefore it's bad, or just machine sew everything from polyester, it's fantasy, it doesn't matter. As you've probably already surmised, my preferred tactic is to go somewhere straight down the middle. Use historical sources to inform and enhance fantasy costuming, while also giving yourself the freedom to wander off a bit. Defining the world. In this video, I'm mainly going to be talking about second world fantasy with a bit of the more fantastical science fiction thrown in. A second world fantasy takes place in a world that is not our own. Middle-earth, Westeros, the Forgotten Realms, or the worlds of The Witcher, The Wheel of Time, and Shadow and Bone, all of which helpfully call their worlds the world, may be more or less inspired by the real world but do not take place there and differ in significant ways. It's also important to remember that fantasy is not one set thing. It's a relatively young genre, and we're still very much making it up as we go along. Ignoring the relatively fledgling success of fantasy and visual media, when you look at late 19th and early 20th century books, it's quite obvious that a lot of people wanted to write fantasy novels, but nobody was really sure how. So you get The Princess and the Goblin because George MacDonald thought that fantasy should work like a fairy tale. You get Conan the Barbarian because Robert E. Howard thought fantasy should work like a classical myth. You get E.R. Edison writing The Worm Ouroboros because he thought fantasy should read like a work of Shakespeare or Marlowe, and this one guy was like, okay. But have you ever read the Prose Edda in the original Norse? Don't ask me why that's the one that stuck. I mean, Conan the Barbarian is horrifically racist. Most early fantasy works are for children. The Worm Ouroboros is... Okay, if you haven't read it, you should read it. It is buck wild, and there is one character who I can only imagine as Tom Hiddleston's Loki. You'll know exactly who I mean if you've read it. But also, it's not good. I understand why the baseline for fantasy ended up being The Lord of the Rings, I do, but can you imagine if the single most influential work on the genre was like Blood in the Mist? The fantasy section of the bookshop would look so different. All of which is to say, I blame Tolkien for every single series that's one straight white guy writing doorstops for 6+ books about a straight white guy saving the world, and I know that's unfair, but I have to blame someone. This opinion has nothing to do with the rest of the video, mostly. So it's not really surprising that we're still figuring out what a fantasy film or television series should look like. In the 80s and 90s, they looked like Disney movies or Ren fairs. By hunting around for things that already existed and looked historical but not historically accurate, a lot of the costumes actually came from European folk costume, or were heavily inspired by modern fashion. Look at the iconic gowns from Labyrinth and Legend if you want to know what I'm talking about. Then Lord of the Rings happened. And it drew very heavily on European history because that's what the Lord of the Rings was all about. It was a mythic Northern European past that never was. But instead of being cheap Ren fair costumes, they put actual effort in, and everybody went, it cost how much? That and the ongoing success of urban fantasy franchises like Buffy, Supernatural, and the movie series from the books that shall not be named, meant that we didn't really go back to medieval-inspired fantasy for a while, and things were pretty quiet until Game of Thrones, at which point everybody went, it cost how much? The fact that Game of Thrones was both so popular and so heroically overproduced, I think, actually put fantasy back in the cupboard for years. Location shooting and hundreds of hand-embroidered costumes are expensive as hell, and how could you compete with Game of Thrones? When you have a world that is explicitly not our own, it's very easy to think you have to make everything up from scratch, or take great pains to hide or avoid every hint of the real world in what you create, which is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. The thing is, you don't. You can cheat, and that's never been more obvious than right now. Which brings us to the present day, and streaming services having finally come up with a way to make second world fantasies on screen in a way that isn't on the scale of the GDP of Liechtenstein. And they've done it by stealing stuff. Okay, fine. Borrowing from historical influences. The Wheel of Time. Thanks, I hate it. Okay, I'm only a couple of episodes in. I fully realise that a lot of people love this show or the books, and I'm not saying they're wrong. It just manages to epitomise everything I hate about traditional fantasy. Also, I really deeply, irrationally hate that one trope that's like, this fantasy setting was secretly the future all along, and given that within the first 5 minutes of the first episode, those better not be ruined skyscrapers. Seriously, if it turns out all along I had Robert Jordan to blame for every time that trope has ruined a book for me, at least there's not a colony ship. Oh god, there's like 13 books. Guys, please tell me now if there's a colony ship. If I put myself through the rest of the series and it turns out there was a colony ship, I will commit crime. Aside from my personal prejudices, this show does something that's very popular in fantasy costuming, and I'm not certain they've done it terribly well. Watching The Wheel of Time, I kept turning around and going, wow, that looks familiar. And now that I've dug into it a bit more, I'm not surprised. In the behind-the-scenes promo videos about the costume designer has a colour-coded map showing the real-world cultural influences they've chosen to use mapped onto the world of The Wheel of Time. Not inherently a terrible idea, but okay, so they're kind of all over the place. The thing about using real-world influences is they don't exist in a vacuum or independent of each other. Sometimes this is as obvious and clear-cut as countries close to each other might share styles, and if they don't, that says something about them. Look at how the fashions of various Italian city-states differed across the 16th century, because despite being physically close, it was difficult to move across borders and regional identities were very strong. Now contrast this to, say, elite Europe in the 18th century, when travel and communication was comparatively easy, and countries as far away as Russia were looking to one centre of fashion, Paris and the French court, to emulate. When you see how long and complicated the history of interaction between two countries, say China and Japan is, that is going to have an effect on their clothing, and it doesn't make sense to put fantasy China and fantasy Japan in very different parts of the map. Also, if you're going to tell me that this area is influenced by 19th century China, and then that area doesn't have, you know, sericulture, Chinese influences on the food or buildings, maybe 90% of the extras are white. You know, it's fantasy, but that doesn't mean you don't respect your sources. Other cultures are not just fonts of good ideas you can cherry pick. Which isn't to say that The Wheel of Time is especially bad at this. It's not Star Wars Episode 1. They do seem to have been fairly thoughtful in showing a diverse range of influences and drawing distinct lines between influences, not the standard fantasy. That country over there is the fantasy Asians. What kind of Asian? We don't know, just Asian. And there are some characters where this has really worked well. The character of Alan is dressed with specifically Korean influences, when the actor, Daniel Henney, is of Korean heritage, and as he himself points out, you don't get a lot of Korean representation. So being able to clearly identify his costume as Korean inspired, not generically Asian, is really great to see, and the level that fantasy should be aspiring to. I just wish it was a little bit more consistent in this show. The Witcher. I unironically love the costumes for The Witcher, and will fight you on this one. That isn't to say there haven't been some missteps. Messiah Simpson deserved better, and I have not played the games, and yeah, what I've seen of the game costume design is out of this world, 10 out of 10. Please can we have Joey Beatty and pumpkin pants? But in general, I think they've done some really fun things, and while it seems to be fashionable to hate on The Witcher's costumes, I think they've been really clever with them. On a macro scale, the Witcher novels are originally written in Polish, and I really enjoy the elements of Eastern European folk costume that are present in the show, whether it's the more obvious shapes and embroidery in some women's costumes, or more subtle things like the asymmetrical opening of Geralt's shirt, something that's far more common historically in North and Eastern Europe and Russia. This show also does a great job of knowing when to step away from historical and real-world influences, and it amuses me no end how many people complain about how impractical and unrealistic costumes like these are when, guys, these are mages. Actually, it's mostly just Yennefer. She can do magic and is not bound by the conventions of any given culture because she exists outside of them. You can tell by the fact that she changes clothes in times and places where she should not have access to new clothes. Nobody in universe made these. Yennefer wanted to look sexy and cool, so she made herself look sexy and cool. It's not weird that nobody else has their shoulders out, it's literally the point. Mages break the rules. Aside from that, I think The Witcher has done a lovely job of character-driven costume that makes sense for the person it's for. Ciri's Season 1 outfit is great because it looks luxurious and high quality, but the cloak has sleeves as well as a big hood, and she has culottes rather than a skirt. Not only is she a very active and adventurous person, her grandmother is a general. There's obviously a precedent for women doing more than sitting around doing embroidery in her family. Clothes that are adapted for active wear makes complete sense in her wardrobe, and they're still fancy because she's a princess. Side note, I adore the fact that we've all internalized Jaskier as some tiny twink, despite the fact that Joey Beatty and Henry Cavill are the same height and the same build, and yet. There's a whole Tumblr post just about the costuming decisions that mean that Geralt looks massive and rugged and manly, and Jaskier looks like a little soft boy, in total contradiction to what the actors actually look like, and I love it. I also particularly like Fringilla's costuming. You'll notice that a lot of the mages wear these long gowns, heavily inspired by the Italian Renaissance, which makes sense given that people associate that period of costuming with you know, opulence, culture, political machinations. So I love that they give her this similar but still very distinct, very simple closed front cloak in season 1, where they've done some cool things with the direction of the nap on the velvet. That's why the fabric looks slightly different around that shaped yoke. It's all the same fabric, it's just orientated differently. And then in season 2, where she's seen some stuff and her opinions on things have changed a bit, she gets this absolutely brilliant dress and gown that's still silver, but opulent, decorated, and heavily Italian Renaissance inspired. I wonder why. Shadow and Bone. Now, admittedly, I only watched Shadow and Bone once I realised the crows were in it. Comment down below who's your favourite and why. It's obviously Jesper. But I did think Shadow and Bone had a really difficult job, more so than anything we've looked at so far. Ravka, Kerch, Fjerda, Shuhan, Novi Zem, and the Wandering Isle have very explicit similarities to real-world countries, some particular cultural influences tied to specific time periods, and due to the existence of firearms like repeating revolvers and other specific machines, no spoilers for the end of Six of Crows, but there are some very specific machines, you can really easily pick a time and place in real-world history that each character might reasonably dress like, but those times and places don't line up with each other, and that would have been really easy and looked kind of weird and inconsistent. Straight up ripping off historical costumes, especially regional historical costumes, is always super dodge, and you don't want to start people going, wait, is Scandinavia evil and the Dutch untrustworthy? Also, there's magic. Okay, yeah, the Grisha aren't technically magic, you know what, don't worry about it. If you haven't seen the series, it's magic. Specifically, there is magic around making things, which as we saw with The Witcher means that at least for some people in some circumstances, you can break all the rules. All of which is to say, I really like what historical influences they did include in the costumes, but I'm also glad they didn't overdo it. Sure, if you know what you're looking for, you'll see immediate similarities between Tsarist Russian military uniforms and Ravkan uniforms. You'll notice that the Queen has white-fronted gowns and Muscovite sleeves, which is evocative of Russian imperial court dress, but not the same. And those tabard-style things that the maids wear might be based on 19th century Russian schoolgirls' uniforms, I think, but nothing is an exact copy. Everything's had changes, it's evocative, not a replica. And of course, the Grisha's Kefta are absolutely unlike what anyone else is wearing. Embroidery does feature heavily on other Ravkan costumes, but it's figurative. Pictures of flowers and such, not the abstract shapes of the Kefta, and the colours are outrageously bold and high contrast. That's because these coats are made with magic, not only to be distinctive, but bulletproof, so they don't have to look the same as what other people are wearing because they don't play by the same rules, and because these characters are supposed to stand out to the audience and seem special. Seriously, fabricators do not get enough credit. Whenever there's a what Grisha are you quiz thingy, everyone wants to be a squaller or a heartrender. Do you know how much easier my job would be if I could manipulate physical materials with my mind? Dune. Okay, I had to put some sci-fi in here somewhere, and I did not want to talk about Star Wars, so let's just tackle the biggest cinematic event of the last 5 years. A lot of science fiction explicitly takes place in our world's future, which gives you a baseline to work from. However, Dune is so far divorced from the Earth that we know it might as well be fantasy. When it comes to clothing construction, we can more or less assume that the cultures of this galaxy-spanning empire can make basically anything they want, and in theory, being this far away from our real world in both space and time, there shouldn't be any real-world influences on what they're wearing. Except, of course, there are. The uniforms are a great example of this. They contain many of the elements that we would associate with imperial uniforms, because as a real-world audience, we are supposed to infer things about these characters, and the costumes do that by drawing on influences we as the audience understand. There's a lot of textured fabrics like linens, gently swirling brocades, heavy knits. Jessica's one tea gown, I think, is a silk fi, which all strike the audience as old-fashioned textiles we're more used to seeing in historical dramas, giving a weight of history and tradition to the outfits. That reflects the storyline. Also, they wear all black. The Atreides are not the good guys. But they've also clearly adjusted some elements to subvert our expectations and remind us that this is happening in a very different world. As an example, I love the undershirts that many Atreides characters wear. They have the asymmetrical opening and stand collar, the same as Geralt of Rivia. That comes from Eastern European and Russian folk costume. But there's no visible closures except for a vague shadow of something within the facing. Guys, I think they close with magnets. And this seems like a minor detail, but does this imply that they either have really good magnets or that they're not washing their clothes with water because most magnetic metals and water is a bad time? We don't know that, and no point do they talk about it. We never see anyone making clothes or doing laundry, but these clothes don't play by the rules as we understand them, so we've already stepped away from everything we as an audience know and put ourselves in another world that feels strange and new and different, and both very old and very advanced at the same time, based on having no obvious closures and a shadow in a facing. Overall, I think they've done an incredible job at making all the clothes in Dune seem weirdly seamless. Like, you can't obviously see how they're constructed, which is incredibly effective in that it makes these clothes seem very futuristic, while simultaneously I, the costumer, am pretty certain that they achieved that through an absolute ton of hand sewing, which is about the oldest technique that there is. Why use historical techniques in your fantasy costumes? So why should you, costumer at home, look to historical and real-world sources when making your fantasy costumes? The first and most obvious answer is, it's going to solve a lot of problems. The techniques that have survived from history are tried, tested, and effective. You can avoid reinventing the wheel in a lot of very tedious and difficult ways by simply using what already exists. The second answer is, it looks good. There's nothing wrong with using whatever techniques and materials you want to, but if you're trying to create the most seamless fantasy experience, pun intended, obvious machine top stitching on your beautiful medieval inspired elven gown will immediately remind people that this is a costume and not a real garment in general use, unless your elves have sewing machines. One of the cornerstones of fantasy is that you make things seem real by evoking the real world and changing only what you need to. The world needs to feel organic and natural and like it works. When you describe a character feeling winded after falling off a horse or the smell of cooking over a campfire in a realistic way, people go, yes, I've experienced that, I can imagine that as though it was real, and that carries over to being able to vividly imagine that unicorns and dragons and magic potions are also real. Having costumes that feel like they should exist and someone in this setting made them helps immerse you in that world. Again, eliminating all machine-sewn hems from your costume is not the kind of standard you at home should be holding yourself to. It's what I expect from multi-million-dollar production companies, but deciding to use a period cutting layout or a historical shape or some hand finishing can take you a good ways into that feeling of reality and immersion. The third answer is that you can layer meaning into your clothing. The way you dress makes people feel a certain way about you, and we form preconceptions about characters based on what they wear. And we culturally have a lot of stereotypes about particular historical periods. The Victorians were uptight and inventive, the 20s were decadent, the Regency is all about romance, steamy or otherwise. You can play on these preconceptions by evoking particular historical eras in your costuming and say lots of things about your fantasy character before you've even opened your mouth. Side note, if what you're trying to say is they're exotic and weird, please just stop using other cultures' clothing to do that. Yes, I'm still mad at you, episode 1. And the final answer is, clothing does not exist in a vacuum. The history of clothing and the history of basically every technological development ever is intrinsically linked. So if your Tudor-style elves are wearing gowns entirely of lace, either they're incredibly rich and bored, or you don't understand how labour-intensive lace is pre the late 19th century. If your peasants are living in mud huts and your knights in shining armour are having jousts, but your princesses are wearing steel-boned corsets and crinolines, I'm going to ask questions about why everyone doesn't have a pocket watch. And if you want things to feel real, you don't want people getting distracted by questions like, wait, why do they have that? Or how do they go to the bathroom? Fun fact, if you have poker, the card game, in your setting, that means you also have statistical probability, which means you could in theory make steam engines. It's the same maths. This is why no one invites me to parties. Now there's a bigger question here of how real do you want your world to feel? Bridgerton, for example, makes no sense. They shouldn't have most of these fabrics or colours, and nobody cares because it's a pleasant fairy tale. Nothing about this is meant to feel especially realistic, except maybe the emotional damage. But it's difficult to pitch yourself as an incredibly realistic and immersive fantasy, especially if you want to get all gritty and grimdark, and then just show a basic lack of understanding along the lines of, where are these pseudo-Vikings getting cotton from? When to do something different. However, friends, having said all that, fantasy is not reality, and sometimes you are going to want to diverge heavily from what is established real-world fact. You might have magic. There's actually a whole heap of things it could be. Materials and technologies that don't exist or never existed at that time, very different cultural or gender norms, magic. And this is actually where those real-world elements do double time, because if you want to go, here are the clothes that are made by magic, look at how magical they are, you need to contrast that against clothes that feel very mundane. Look at how saturated the Grisha Kefta are compared to the clothes of the wealthy. Look at how Yennefer of Vengerberg's gowns are made of materials that just don't make sense, or Tessire's weird sculptural tailoring. These clothes don't follow conventional rules, and that's the point. Obviously, this isn't the only example of times when your fantasy needs to go off in a different direction, but if you want to be able to go, hey, these people have special clothes for special reasons, as well as giving yourself more leeway to do wild things, it helps to have a more normal baseline to contrast that to. Conclusion. So what have we learned? Fantasy doesn't mean you have to make everything up from scratch. Audiences bring their own preconceptions. Hand finishing is basically magic or extremely advanced technology, which is indistinguishable. Respect your sources. And don't put a 19th century Mongolian wedding dress on a character from a tropical ocean planet with no horses just because you think it looks exotic. It's been 23 years and I'm still mad. If you're still intrigued by the idea of making your own fantasy costumes, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to keep the YouTube gods happy, follow me on Instagram to keep my cat happy, and very many thanks to my Ko-fi donators who are keeping me happy. If you'd like to join them, there's a link in my description where you can leave a one-off or reoccurring donation to support this channel and my growing collection of Joey Beatty memorabilia. Dream big, and I'll see you very soon.